Stick with me, guys, and I'm going to show you how to start this Gen 4 LY6 LS motor on a stand. Join me while I take this Gen 4 LY6 and swap it into my 98 Chevy Suburban. So when I was first starting this project, I got on the internet looking for information on how to start an LS on a stand. And the first thing I realized was there's a ton of information for Gen 3 LSs, and there's not nearly as much for Gen 4. So I found a couple videos out there that were relevant and that helped me out. Most of them were for Gen 3 motors, but I decided to make this video specifically because there was very little in terms of the electronics and the wiring on the internet available, in YouTube especially. I did find some information on lt1swap.com that helped me out a ton, including some schematics, pinouts. I wanted to start this engine on a stand because it came from a wrecked truck, and before I did anything to try to rebuild it, I figured it would be easiest and also really cool if I could start it right here on the stand, make sure I got oil pressure, make sure everything runs like it should. As best as you can tell with it on the stand, that is. Guys, before you beat me up too bad, just know, I admit, I am a novice at best. I wouldn't have gotten nearly as far as I have already without a ton of help from the internet and a couple friends of mine. So don't beat me up too bad. If you're doing this, it's probably not the best idea to do it inside. Have a little common sense, maybe a little more than me. Try to do it outside. Also, have a fire extinguisher on hand. Have two. Put one outside if you're going to start it inside in case you got to evacuate. When you're hooking up the fuel system, it's important. You don't want any leaks. You don't want any gasoline sitting on top of the motor or anything that could have vapors. When you're trying to troubleshoot this, you've got sparks coming from the battery. There's flames shooting out the headers, which is awesome. Of course, things you'll definitely need an engine stand. I got mine off Jegs, it was like 50 bucks. Once I got the motor hung and on the stand, I went ahead and removed all the accessories, including the power steering unit, the water pump, the alternator, AC compressor. Got all that stuff out of the way. It significantly lightened the motor. I could tell on the stand it was much lighter, and you just don't need them. One thing that's kind of important that gave me a little trouble at first, a real simple fix, thanks to a buddy of mine, he told me just swap these bolts around. These bolts initially were going through this way. Instead of the bolt head being here and the threads this way, I had the bolt head out here and the threads going this way, and this section right here just barely touching the flywheel. So I hung the motor again, swap the bolts around, put the nuts on this side, the bolt head on this side, and as you can see, there is more than enough clearance now for this flywheel to turn without getting or hitting the bolts. These bolts are from Jegs. They're about 15-20 bucks. The size on those bolts is M10-1.5. Apparently, I've learned is a little different than the small block Chevy thread pattern, so just know that. One thing I discovered after starting this motor on the stand a few times, they're not meant to be started on the stand. Don't kid yourself. It's dangerous. Actually, after, I said I was going to only start it once or twice, but then I started it and it was awesome. So before I knew it, I had started it about 30 times over the course of a couple weeks. Make sure your locking pin is in. If that wasn't in, I'm sure the motor would turn on the stand and probably fall over, probably tear it up. As you can see, I've gone a little extra step, which I don't think it does much, but I've strapped left my handle in, and I've strapped it to the base of the stand, and that helps it from a little wobble. Now, a friend of mine knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, told me make sure I have some kind of exhaust on, whether it's the factory exhaust manifolds or headers. I've got a great deal on these headers thanks to him, and I went ahead and just put them on just because they're awesome. I wanted to see what they look like. So it's easy to do, and supposedly without having any exhaust, you can damage the heads. I'm not sure about all that. I don't know how that works, but I did also learn, which is kind of interesting, that there are these little tabs here on the back of the motor. They actually say warranty void if removed. I believe those are little spots of lead, and if they melt, run down the heads, then you know right away the motor has probably been overheated. So before you get started, one of the first things you got to do is take your ECM, send it off, or take it to a local tuner and get your VATS removed, vehicle anti-theft system. I spent 60, 70 bucks and sent it to PCM. I believe they're in North Carolina, but within a week I had it back in my possession, so that worked out great for me. So one thing you got to make certain of before you start this guy up, I'm gonna come down here on top of the oil filter. Of course, make sure you got a oil filter that's not leaking. It's still there. This is an oil cooler line block-off plate. This actually came from the junkyard off a 5.3 motor. This is an area where you could potentially tap in a oil pressure gauge or sending unit. That's actually blanked off under there. It's not actually open. It's just blanked off under there. But what this allows to happen is the oil pump pumps oil up into this, between these two bolts and back into the motor. If you had an oil cooler, it would pump it through here to the oil cooler and back into the motor. It's critical. This is probably not going to be installed. If you get your motor from a 2500, it will probably come with an oil cooler. And when they take the motor out, they don't blank this off. So you can buy those online cheap, relatively cheap. You can get them from the junkyard even cheaper. You got to make sure you got it on there, or else you'll lose the oil out of the side of your motor. My engine did not come with oil in it, so I topped it off. I installed an oil pressure gauge. I got the cheapest one on Amazon. It was like $18.99. So this is the inexpensive mechanical oil pressure gauge that I've got rigged up here. Just got this little nylon tube, runs to the back of the motor. Of course, you want to make sure you keep that away from your flywheel back there, of course. I did get a fitting. It's an Autometer 2268, and I actually installed it in the back of the motor, which allows you to adapt a mechanical gauge into the factory electronic oil pressure sending unit spot. Works great. Does leak a little, but I'm going to be taking all this down here in a little while to rebuild anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Fill the engine with oil. Let it crank over. In that time period, I did not actually get any oil pressure on the gauge, but once I just went ahead and went for it, fired it off, got oil pressure immediately within the first half a second of the motor starting. My engine did come with a factory wiring harness, and so far it has not been modified. I do have the underhood fuse block. Don't have to have a remote starter. You can just use a switch. It's just jumping the leads on the starter. It is kind of cool though, just to be able to pull the trigger. Starter wire comes up here. I had to cheat a little bit. With this particular motor starter, there is a recessed plug you got to connect to, and you can't get this clip attached to it. So I just used a little quick connector, poked it up in there, and then zip tied it so that it continues to touch. The other lead is hooked onto the positive wire coming from your battery. It comes up around here and just goes right here. So battery power comes up, goes to the starter here. Of course, your negative is connected to the block here. The other negative that comes off the negative battery just ends. It's not connected to anything. So all you need is your negative terminal connected to the block, the factory ground location.
coming off your positive, one wire lead goes to the fuse panel, right here on the fuse panel. So the only thing you should have connected on the fuse panel is that one wire there going to the positive lead on the battery. Your one plug coming from the main harness, and then you're going to have this red or this jumper wire connected to P5 on the plug. All the other wiring, pretty much straightforward. Got your ECM plugged in with both plugs. All right, guys. So you're gonna take a wire. If you got a clip, use a clip, or you can just wrap it around the positive terminal. But this connection here is gonna go back to, follow it all the way back to your fuse box. You're gonna tie in to P5. All right, you can find the schematics for this plug to help you locate the pink wire here, P5, and that's where you're gonna tie in. I use a little quick splice connector instead of removing this pin and stuff. Seems to work great so far. If you wanna hook the pedal up, mine was cut. I just had a length of wire here like this, and I actually ended up using the schematic that I found on lt1swap.com to determine which, looks like this, which plug I need to wire this pedal into. And then in order to find the rest of the story, I used a schematic that I'll link in the bottom of this, in the description of this video. I actually Google searched this as an LY6 schematic. And somewhere around right here, you've got the accelerator pedal, and you trace the wires up, and it shows them going directly into one of the plugs on the ECM. So I came over here, I popped the plug apart, just a couple clips, and you can actually see the back side of the plug. And I clipped the wires that go into the pedal, and I just used some little solder connections here to wire the pedal in. Of course, when I install the motor, I'll have to redo most of this stuff, but just for testing purposes, that worked really good. And I was able to use my pedal, just mounted it on a board here that's supporting the motor a little bit. Important not to rev the motor up a bunch. You've got no tack, so you can't go too high. You don't want to damage anything. So, what the pedal does actually, what you can do is connect your positive battery terminal. Listen. Got some solenoids and some clicking going on. That just gave power to this P5 wire. Now I've got my gas pedal down there. Now if you don't know if you have all the fuses in that you need, you can copy this. I know this fuse panel works to do what we're doing here today. All right, so the fuel system. It's real simple. I got this idea from a guy I found on the internet. I'll put his video in the description as well on YouTube. He gave me the idea for the fuel system, which I think it really didn't save me as much money as I would like it to, but it works great. And for only having to start this thing a few times, or needing to start this motor a few times on the stand, it's all I need. Really impressed with that. I've got some fuel line from an old outboard motor connected to an air fitting that you can get at the Home Depot air compressor aisle. All this stuff came from Home Depot for this setup, and it costs around 70 bucks. Granted, I bought some parts I probably didn't need and didn't use, but gonna need some fittings. I actually threaded metal pipe end here, threaded this valve into it. Works great. Allows you to remove this system from the fuel line, fill it with fuel without spilling any fuel. Of course, I fill this pipe by taking the top cap off. I put it in a vise, take the top cap off with the bottom valve closed, and fill it from the top. I'd say it runs for probably, if you wanted to, you could probably run it for 2, 3, 4 minutes with this setup before you have to refill it. Of course, you could always make the pipe longer. I've got some more fuel line hose from the outboard going to a fitting that actually connects to a quick coupler that connects to my air compressor. It's important. 60 pounds on your regulator. This is just a cheap regulator. Seems to work great. I did try to go in, deliver fuel to the fuel rail here using a fitting I got on eBay. It's a Schrader valve fitting, but this did not work. I don't believe the inside of this fitting actually depressed the valve or sealed up correctly. I'm not sure. I even tried removing the inside of the Schrader valve. No go on that. So what I did was I ended up going into the fuel rail from the factory location that comes from the fuel pump. Comes down out of my fuel pump, comes in here, goes to the other side of the fuel rail through here, comes to this side here. There's a regulator up here, I believe. I took a piece of hose, hooked onto that, and just plugged it off. Super simple. This is just pressed on with a hose clamp. Just nothing special. There's no Schrader valve there, but 60 pounds doesn't blow it off.